In the last couple of weeks, I've made two videos. One explaining why I think that Israel should exist, and one explaining why I think Palestine should exist. In those, I made a somewhat brief positive argument for their existence, but I spent most of the time addressing arguments that they shouldn't exist and why I think those arguments are wrong. Now, I very intentionally didn't talk about might makes right, because I think that's an obviously bad argument. But after releasing the first video, a friend asked me about an argument that Candace Owens made that is effectively might makes right.
The favorite thing that they always say is Israel can defend itself. Israel can defend itself. It just never does. That's the only thing. It never does because it actually can't, which begs the question that if you're a nation and you can't defend yourself, are you even a nation? If you have to rely on the might of another nation, on the tax dollars of another nation, why do you even qualify as being a nation if might makes right? That's a question that we can ask another day.
Now, in fairness, it is a little bit more sophisticated than a generic might makes right argument. So, I'm Buck Kansas. Let's talk about it. Candace's question blends three arguments together. She starts by saying that Israel hasn't and can't defend itself. Then she says that begs the question, does a nation exist if it can't defend itself? And then supports that with, after all, might makes right. So that first part is more of a historical question. Has Israel defended itself without substantial international support? The second one is touching on, does a nation exist, with a specific argument that a nation must be able to defend itself to exist. And then that third part is touching on the question, should a nation exist, with the specific argument that a nation's ability to defend itself justifies its existence. That last third one is the only one that is a might makes right argument. Let's talk about all three. Let's start with that historical question. Has Israel defended itself, or has it only been able to survive through the support of other nations, particularly the US? Well, Israel's been involved in a lot of conflicts. The first conflict was in 1948. It's often called the First Israeli-Arab Conflict, where Israel won its independence through a war with its surrounding Arab neighbors. In that war, Israel received no military support from other nations. They did buy weapons from Czechoslovakia, but so did the Arab nations. Czechoslovakia wasn't really picking a side in the conflict. They were just the international arms dealer at the time. Notably, there were World War II volunteers who came and helped the Israelis, particularly by contributing know-how on how to train the Israeli fighters. These were called the Mahal, which is a guess on the pronunciation, and it was mostly comprised of Jews from around the world, but particularly Jews from America and Britain. Regardless of their national identity, I think that it's hard to argue that individuals choosing to volunteer to support Israel means their nations were supporting Israel. So Israel definitely defended itself on its founding and in its founding war without significant aid from other nations. The second Arab-Israeli conflict was in 1956, and I'd say that war wasn't particularly defensive. I will admit that of Israel's many conflicts, it's probably the one I know the least about, but Israel attacked Egypt to try to gain access to the Suez Canal after Egypt closed the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. I wouldn't say that that's really a defensive war per se, so it doesn't really address the question at hand. The third Arab-Israeli conflict was in 1967. Whether or not it was defensive is a big talking point, as Israel preemptively attacked, although there's very good evidence that the Arab nations in the war were preparing to attack Israel. But regardless, Israel clearly won that war. So what kind of support did Israel have in that war? Well, the US had started selling some weapons to Israel in 1961, but the major supplier of weapons to Israel was France, who sold most of Israel their weapons. Right before the war, France placed an embargo on arms sales to nations that were going to be involved in the conflict. Notably, France decided to fulfill contracts that were in place before 1967 to Middle Eastern countries, but Israel had paid for 50 fighter jets, and France decided not to give it to them, even though their broad policy seems like they should have. They were pretty mad by the end and had decided that they wanted to transition their support away from Israel and toward the Arab nations and start building a diplomatic relationship with other Middle Eastern nations. Leading up to that war, Israel was buying weapons from the US and from France. I don't think buying weapons is really what we mean by military aid. Typically, when I hear people complain about military aid, their complaint goes something like, why are we spending so much money on Israel when we could spend that money at home?
If you have to rely on the might of another nation, on the tax dollars of another nation, why do you even qualify as being a nation?
Well, if we were just selling them weapons, that's not the same thing as giving them money. We started giving them money in the 70s. This is what I think we mean when we talk about giving military aid, giving money to buy military equipment. Particularly the way we do this is we give grants to buy US military hardware. Think of it as giving in-store credit to buy from the US military and military contractors. It's how we typically do military aid, and it's usually categorized as part of military spending. The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act just passed the House, and it includes aid for Ukraine, and it at least continues some military programs with Israel. So since the 70s, we've been giving this grant money to Israel. Does it make a difference? Certainly somewhat. They would have to fight differently if they couldn't afford our weapons, or if they couldn't afford as many of our weapons. But would they not be able to defend themselves without us? That's beyond unclear. They had successful wars before our aid, and they still would have what they currently do if we stopped giving them aid. What's more, they currently have many fewer hostile neighbors than ever before because of the Abraham Accords. So, my suspicion is that if we stopped giving military aid now, they would survive. In part because their current military hardware is way more advanced than anyone in the region, and in part because of the normalized relationships with their neighbors. Let's move on to that second argument. Does a nation exist if it can't defend itself? Well, I think a nation exists if a collection of people claim sovereignty over a land they live in and are able to defend that claim from rivals. But I don't think that defense needs to be based purely on their own martial prowess. I think diplomacy can be an effective defense. North Korea exists because of its alliance with China. Taiwan exists because of its relationship with the US. If neither of those nations had those diplomatic relationships, their rivals would likely destroy them. I think economic interdependence can be a great defense. Much of Europe is so economically interdependent on each other that a war would cost more than it would gain, which at least explains somewhat why we're seeing less wars in Europe. I also think that defense can be based on military support from your allies. There's a reasonable argument that Ukraine exists today and is able to resist Russia so well because of international support, particularly US military support. I'm not certain that Russia would win if we stopped giving support to Ukraine, but it seems like the support has had a significant impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And I hope, for the record, that that continues. And I think there's probably a lot more arguments about how a nation is able to defend itself from rivals. I don't really know how the Vatican exists. They're a very strange nation. It seems like their ability to defend themselves is based on culture, maybe religion, or perhaps just by not really having any rivals who want to take their land. So ultimately, my answer is yes, a nation has to be able to defend itself in order to exist, but no, that defense doesn't need to be based solely on their own military might. Let's move to that third argument. Should a nation exist if it cannot defend itself? Does might make right? I've already said easy answer, no, but let's go a little bit deeper there. If a nation doesn't exist, that doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. India wasn't a nation while it was a colony of Britain, but there's little debate that part of why it became a nation is because it should be a nation. And what's more, the opposite seems to apply as well. A nation existing doesn't mean it should. North Korea shouldn't exist. There should be one Korea, and it shouldn't be a dictatorship. I think a nation is justified by popular sovereignty. If a majority of people in a relevant area agree to be subject to a national government, then that national government justifiably exists. Why doesn't might make right? Well, in a broad way, might makes right is a dumb idea. It's saying that if I get away with something, then it's good that I did it. So, murder, theft, and rape, if I get away with it, are good that I did it because I had the might to do it. I was clever enough to get away and strong enough to commit those heinous acts. But if I get stopped for doing something, then it's bad that I tried. Attempted murder, attempted theft, attempted rape are worse than getting away with those crimes. That's obviously wrong. There's a clear moral intuition that doesn't make any sense. But part of the reason I picked those as examples is to demonstrate that you don't get guidance into what you should do. Might makes right looks backwards at actions you've taken and justifies those actions. If I have an ability to do something, then it's the right thing to do. That means I can't know what is right until after I've done it. Success versus failure determines the moral worth of my actions. So if I'm trying to figure out what I should do, I really don't know. I can only know if what I've done is good, and what I've done is good because I had the might to do it. In reality, might makes right is a defense of the status quo. What has been done is good. I don't know anyone who thinks that's true. Now, Candace Owens was not making a broad argument that might makes right is a good moral principle. She was specifically saying that in the context of justifying a nation's existence, does might make right? And I'd say no. You can have popular sovereignty and fail to defend your nation. A nation that exists justly can cease to exist, and a nation that exists unjustly can continue to exist. North Korea. So I don't think any of these three arguments work, but I also think that's kind of not Candace's real point. She already believes that Israel shouldn't exist, so she thinks we shouldn't give them military aid. From the little bit of viewing of Candace Owens I've done, it seems like the reason she thinks that Israel shouldn't exist is that Israel is evil. That's an argument that I did address in my video on should Israel exist, and if you want more on that, go ahead and give that a watch. But regardless, I've been Buck Kansas. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. It helps out a lot. Bye!